There's a shift happening in the global gold market that most people aren't paying attention to. And it's not just about how much gold central banks are buying, though that number is significant. It's about where they're storing it. For decades, the standard practice for central banks around the world was to store a significant portion of their gold reserves in New York, at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, or in London at the Bank of England. Those two locations were considered the safest, most liquid, most trusted storage points for sovereign gold. But over the last several years, that's been changing, and the change accelerated dramatically in the last 18 months. Central banks are not only buying gold at record levels, over 1,000 tons per year for 3 years running, but they're increasingly repatriating their gold from New York and London, or bypassing those locations entirely and storing newly purchased gold domestically or in alternative jurisdictions. Right now, as I'm tracking this trend through official data and central bank disclosures. Comment when you're watching, because this is one of those structural shifts that happen slowly and then all at once. And if you're seeing this in real time, you're watching the global monetary system reorganize itself. And if you value analysis that connects geopolitical shifts to market reality, subscribe and comment FinTalk OG so the algorithm knows you're here for the strategic intelligence that matters. Now, before I show you the data, let me explain why this matters, even if you're not a central bank. Where central banks store their gold tells you a lot about trust, about geopolitics, about the future of the international monetary system. If central banks trusted the US and UK completely, they'd be comfortable leaving their gold in New York and London, where it's historically been liquid and accessible for international transactions. But if they're pulling gold out, or if they're avoiding those locations for new purchases, it tells you they're worried. Worried about sanctions, worried about confiscation, worried about access, worried about a world where holding your most strategic reserve asset in a potential adversary's vault is a liability, not an asset. And when the world's central banks are making that calculation, it changes everything. It changes the role of the dollar. It changes the power dynamics in global finance. And it changes the value and the role of gold itself. Here's what I'm going to cover. First, the data on central bank gold buying and how it's reached historic levels. Second, the repatriation trend. Which countries have pulled gold out of New York and London, how much, and what they've said publicly about why. Third, where central banks are storing gold now, from domestic vaults to Singapore to Shanghai to Switzerland. And fourth, what this means for the dollar, for gold prices, and for the future of reserve asset management. Let's get into it. Let's start with the buying data. According to the World Gold Council, which aggregates data from central banks and international institutions, central banks have been net buyers of gold every year since 2010. But the pace of buying accelerated dramatically starting in 2022. In 2022, central banks bought approximately 1,136 tons of gold. That was the highest annual total in over 50 years, going back to 1967. In 2023, central bank buying remained strong at around 1,037 tons, and in 2024 and into 2025, the pace has stayed elevated. Preliminary estimates for 2025 suggest central banks bought over 1,000 tons again, marking 3 consecutive years of 1,000-plus ton buying. To put that in perspective, total annual gold mine production is around 3,000 to 3,200 tons globally. Central banks are absorbing roughly one-third of annual mine supply. That's a massive structural bid under the market. And it's persistent. It's not speculative. Central banks aren't buying gold to flip it for profit. They're buying it to hold for decades or generations as a reserve asset. That's sticky demand that removes supply from the market permanently. Now here's the critical part. Not all of that buying is being disclosed transparently. The World Gold Council's figures are based on reported purchases and on implied purchases where they can infer buying from changes in reserves minus known sales. But many central banks don't report their gold purchases in real time. Some report with a lag, some report sporadically, and some don't report at all until they decide to update their official reserve figures. China, for example, went months without reporting gold purchases, then suddenly announced they'd added hundreds of tons. Russia has been opaque about portions of their buying. Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds and central banks often don't report at all. So the 1,000 plus tons per year figure is likely an underestimate. Actual buying is probably closer to 1,200 to 1,500 tons per year when you include unreported accumulation. Who's buying? The biggest buyers in recent years have been China, Russia, India, Turkey, Poland, Singapore, Qatar, Wei, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan. That's a mix of emerging markets, BRICS nations, and countries that are strategically hedging against dollar dominance, notably absent from the buyer list, the United States and most Western European countries. The U.S. hasn't added to its gold reserves in decades. Germany, France, Italy, they're holders, but not buyers. The buying is concentrated in the East and in countries that are actively pursuing de-dollarization or reserve diversification strategies. Now let's talk about the storage shift. For decades, a large portion of the world's central bank gold was stored in New York and London. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York holds gold on behalf of numerous foreign central banks in its vault 80 feet below street level in Manhattan. At its peak, the New York Fed held over 12,000 tons of foreign central bank gold. The Bank of England similarly holds gold for foreign central banks and acts as a hub for international gold trading and settlement. Together, these two locations were the backbone of the global gold storage and settlement system. But starting in the early 2010s, and accelerating after 2014, central banks started asking for their gold back. Here's a timeline of major repatriations. Germany started repatriating gold from New York and Paris in 2013. They announced plans to bring back 674 tons. By 2017, they'd completed the repatriation ahead of schedule. Germany now stores roughly 50% of its gold domestically in Frankfurt, with the rest split between New York, London, and Paris. The Bundesbank was explicit about why. They wanted physical control of their reserves, and they wanted to reassure the German public that the gold was real and accessible. Netherlands repatriated 122 tons of gold from New York in 2014. The Dutch central bank said it was to improve public confidence and to have gold closer to home in case of crisis. Austria repatriated 110 tons from London between 2015 and 2018. They now store roughly 50% domestically, 30% in London, and 20% in Switzerland. Turkey has been aggressively repatriating gold. In recent years, Turkey moved hundreds of tons of gold from the U.S. back to Ankara. Turkey's official gold reserves have increased from around 116 tons in 2017 to over 540 tons as of recent data, and the majority is now stored domestically. This coincided with deteriorating U.S.-Turkey relations, sanctions concerns, and Turkey's push for greater financial sovereignty. Poland repatriated 100 tons from London in 2019, bringing it back to Warsaw. Poland has continued to buy gold aggressively and store it domestically. Their reserves have grown from around 100 tons in 2018 to over 330 tons today, most of it in Poland. Hungary repatriated 100,000 ounces, roughly 3 none, from London in 2018 and has since increased reserves, storing them domestically. Venezuela attempted to repatriate gold from the Bank of England, but was blocked due to political disputes over government legitimacy. As of recent reports, Venezuela has roughly 31 tons of gold held at the Bank of England that they cannot access. This case has become a cautionary tale for other countries about the risks of storing gold in foreign jurisdictions where access can be denied based on political disputes. Russia has been one of the most aggressive in pulling gold out of Western vaults. After sanctions related to Ukraine and geopolitical tensions escalated in 2014, and then again in 2022, Russia moved virtually all of its gold reserves domestically. Russia's official gold reserves are now around 2,300 tons, and it's all stored in Russia. They learned from the 2022 experience, where hundreds of billions of dollars of their foreign currency reserves held abroad were frozen. Gold held domestically can't be frozen by foreign governments. China has never stored significant amounts of gold in New York or London. From the beginning of their modern gold accumulation, which accelerated in the 2000s, China has stored gold domestically in vaults in Beijing and other secure locations. China's official reserves are reported at around 2,260 tons, but as I've covered before, actual holdings are likely much higher and all stored within China. What's the pattern here? Countries that are concerned about sanctions, geopolitical conflict, or loss of access are pulling gold home or avoiding Western storage entirely. Countries that are pursuing dedollarization or reserve diversification are doing the same. And even countries that remain allied with the West, like Germany, Austria, and Poland, are choosing to hold a larger percentage of their gold domestically for sovereignty and confidence reasons. So where are central banks storing gold now, if not in New York and London? There are several key locations. Domestic vaults. The most obvious shift is toward domestic storage. Countries are building or expanding secure vault facilities within their own borders. Russia, China, Turkey, Poland, India all have invested heavily in domestic vault infrastructure. The advantage is complete sovereignty. No foreign government can freeze or deny access to gold stored domestically. The disadvantage is that domestically stored gold is less liquid for international transactions and settlements. But in a world where trust in the international system is eroding, liquidity is less important than control. Switzerland remains a trusted, neutral jurisdiction. The Swiss National Bank and private vault operators like BRICS and Loomis in Switzerland hold significant central bank gold. Switzerland is not part of the EU. It has strong property rights and rule of law, and it has a long history of neutrality. For central banks that want their gold outside their own country, but also outside US-UK control, Switzerland is a preferred alternative. Singapore has positioned itself as the Switzerland of Asia. They've built massive secure vault facilities and offered attractive legal and tax frameworks for precious metals storage. Several Asian central banks and sovereign wealth funds are believed to be using Singapore for gold storage. The Monetary Authority of Singapore has encouraged this as part of their strategy to become a regional financial hub. Shanghai, China has been developing Shanghai as a gold trading and storage hub. The Shanghai Gold Exchange is now the world's largest physical gold exchange by volume. Vaults in Shanghai hold gold for Chinese entities and increasingly for other Asian central banks and institutions that want exposure to the Chinese market or that want storage outside Western jurisdictions. The Shanghai International Gold Exchange allows foreign participants, and there are reports that some central banks are using Shanghai for storage, though details are opaque. Dubai and the Wei has become a major gold trading and storage hub. Dubai's gold market is one of the largest in the world. Secure vault facilities in Dubai serve Middle Eastern and African central banks and sovereign wealth funds. The UAE's strategic location between East and West, combined with strong security and rule of law, makes it attractive for gold storage. Other regional hubs, countries are also establishing regional storage arrangements. The BRICS nations have discussed creating a BRICS gold trading platform and potentially a shared reserve facility, though this is still in early stages.
Central Asian countries like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, which produce gold domestically, are storing reserves domestically and discussing regional cooperation. Latin American countries are exploring similar arrangements. The overall trend is fragmentation and decentralization. Instead of a system where New York and London are the dominant hubs, we're moving toward a multipolar system where gold is stored in multiple regional hubs, with a strong preference for domestic or friendly jurisdiction storage over potentially adversarial jurisdictions.
Now let's talk about what this means for the dollar. The dollar's dominance as the global reserve currency has been underpinned by several factors: the size and liquidity of U.S. capital markets, the rule of law, the U.S. military, and critically, trust. Foreign central banks held dollars and dollar-denominated assets like treasuries because they trusted that those assets were safe and accessible. Part of that trust extended to gold stored in New York. Storing gold at the New York Fed was seen as a way to keep gold liquid and available for international settlements while also signaling trust in the U.S. financial system. But when central banks pull gold out of New York, or when new buyers avoid New York entirely, that's a trust signal. It says, we're not confident that if a geopolitical conflict arises, or if sanctions are imposed, or if relations deteriorate, that we'll have access to our gold. And if you don't trust the U.S. to safeguard your gold, why would you trust the U.S. to safeguard your dollars? The two are linked. The repatriation of gold is part of a broader de-dollarization trend. Countries are reducing their holdings of U.S. treasuries, they're settling trade in alternative currencies, they're building payment systems that bypass SWIFT, and they're storing gold outside U.S. control. All of these moves are connected. They're all expressions of the same underlying loss of trust in U.S.-dominated financial infrastructure. Now, does this mean the dollar is going to collapse tomorrow? No. The dollar is still the dominant reserve currency. Roughly 58% of global foreign exchange reserves are held in dollars, down from over 70% 2 decades ago, but still the majority. The euro is second at around 20%. No other currency is close. But the trend is clear. The dollar's share is declining. And the pace of decline has accelerated in recent years. If central banks continue to diversify away from dollars, and if they continue to accumulate and repatriate gold, the dollar's dominance will erode further. And at some point, the loss of reserve currency status becomes a tipping point where confidence collapses and the dollar weakens sharply. We're not there yet. But the foundation is being chipped away. What does this mean for gold prices? Several things. First, persistent central bank demand creates a floor under the gold market. Even if private investors sell, even if ETFs see outflows, even if jewelry demand softens, central banks are buying 1,000+ tons per year. That's structural support. It means gold is unlikely to see sustained crashes the way it might if demand were purely speculative. Second, the repatriation trend reduces available supply in the London and New York markets. When 500 or 1,000 tons of gold leaves the Bank of England or the New York Fed and gets shipped to Warsaw, Ankara, or Moscow, that's gold that's no longer available for lending, for leasing, or for settlement in the Western gold market. It tightens the physical market in those hubs, and tighter physical supply supports higher prices. Third, the shift toward domestic and alternative storage signals that central banks see gold as an increasingly important strategic asset. They're not just buying it as a hedge or a portfolio diversifier, they're buying it as a core reserve asset that they want under their direct physical control. That mentality drives sustained buying and limited selling. And it reinforces gold's role as money, not just as a commodity. Fourth, If the trend continues, and if more countries follow the repatriation path, it could break the London-New York pricing dominance. For decades, gold prices have been set primarily in London and New York Mike. But if a significant portion of global gold is no longer stored or traded in those locations, if it's in Shanghai, Singapore, Dubai, and domestic vaults, then pricing power could shift. We could see regional gold markets with different prices reflecting local supply and demand. We could see fragmented gold markets where gold in Shanghai trades at a premium to London, or where domestically stored gold has different liquidity and pricing characteristics than gold in the traditional hubs. That fragmentation would be bullish for gold overall because it would reduce the ability of any single market or group of players to suppress prices. Fifth, geopolitical risk premium gets priced into gold. The fact that central banks are pulling gold out of New York and London is itself evidence that geopolitical risk is rising, and when geopolitical risk is high, gold benefits as a safe haven. The repatriation trend and the buying trend reinforce each other in a feedback loop. Rising geopolitical tensions drive repatriation. Repatriation signals distrust. Distrust drives more buying and more repatriation, and all of it supports higher gold prices. Now let's connect this to silver. Silver doesn't get the same attention from central banks because it's not traditionally held as a reserve asset the way gold is. Central banks hold thousands of tons of gold. They hold little to no silver. But the dynamics I'm describing for gold have spillover effects for silver. First, if gold prices rise due to central bank buying and geopolitical demand, silver tends to follow. The gold-silver ratio dynamics mean that silver catches up, often with more volatility. Second, if the global financial system fragments and if alternative reserve systems develop, silver could play a role. There have been discussions in BRICS and other forums about commodity-backed currencies or settlement systems. Those discussions usually focus on gold, but silver has been mentioned as a supplementary asset due to its industrial uses and monetary history. Third, the distrust of Western financial infrastructure that's driving gold repatriation also drives interest in hard assets more broadly, including silver. And fourth, as I've covered, several countries, including Russia and China, are accumulating silver quietly, likely for strategic reasons. If that trend continues, silver could see its own repatriation and accumulation wave. Now let's talk about the risks and counter-arguments. Some will say this is just a few countries, it's not a global trend. But the data shows it's not a few. Germany, Netherlands, Austria, Poland, Hungary, Turkey, Russia, and others have repatriated or are storing domestically. That's a significant portion of global reserves. And the trend is accelerating, not slowing. Others will say repatriation is expensive and inconvenient. Central banks will realize it's easier to keep gold in New York and London. But for countries that have experienced sanctions, frozen assets, or political pressure, convenience is secondary to sovereignty. And the cost of repatriation, transport, insurance, building vaults is trivial compared to the strategic value of controlling your reserves. Some will argue the U.S. would never confiscate foreign gold, so this fear is overblown. But Venezuela's gold is literally frozen in London right now. Russia's foreign currency reserves were frozen. If it can happen to currency reserves, it can happen to gold. And even if the probability is low, the consequences are catastrophic, so countries are taking precautions. And finally, some will say gold doesn't matter anymore. The world has moved on to digital currencies and fiat systems. But if gold doesn't matter, why are central banks buying it at record levels? Why are they going to the trouble and expense of repatriating it? The revealed preference of central banks, what they actually do with their reserves, tells you that gold still matters. A lot. Here's my final take. Central banks are buying gold at historic levels and they're pulling it out of New York and London. That's not a coincidence. It's a coordinated response to a perceived increase in geopolitical risk, a decline in trust in US and UK dominated financial infrastructure, and a desire for greater sovereignty over reserve assets. This trend is structural, not cyclical. It's been building for over a decade, and it's accelerating. And it has profound implications for the dollar, for gold prices, for the international monetary system, and for anyone trying to understand where the world is heading. If you own gold or silver, this is validation. The smartest, most informed institutions in the world, central banks with access to intelligence and analysis that retail investors don't have, are betting on gold. They're accumulating it. They're repatriating it. They're treating it as a strategic asset. That's the ultimate endorsement. If you're trying to decide whether gold still has a role in a modern portfolio, watch what central banks do, not what financial media says. Central banks are acting like gold is the most important asset they own, and they're willing to pay significant costs to control it physically. Tell me in the comments, did you know that central banks were pulling gold out of New York and London? And do you think this trend continues or reverses? Because if it continues, we're watching the foundation of the post-World War II monetary system crack in real time. If this breakdown connected the dots between central bank behavior, geopolitics, and the future of reserve assets, subscribe and comment FinTalk OG. And share this with someone trying to understand why gold keeps going up despite skepticism from mainstream finance. One last thing. This is analysis based on official central bank data, World Gold Council reports, and public disclosures. It's not financial advice. Geopolitics is unpredictable. I could be wrong about the implications. Use this as one input. Do your own research and make decisions based on your own situation and risk tolerance. All right, follow the central banks, watch where the gold goes, and I'll see you in the next one.